Well, welcome in, everyone. I'm Jay Smith, and this is Bradley Kendall, and this is After Further Review, Tiger Vision's weekly college football rundown show. Bradley, it's week 11 now.
Week 11
I think
already.
The college
the season
football,
has flown by.
College football playoff rankings just came out about an hour ago, so let's jump right into it after further review.
It's the Little Big Ten now, not the Big Ten. The Little Ten. They've been struggling. They kind of imploded this week. We got Wisconsin that's still sticking around, but other than that, they really have no hope to get a playoff spot, which is kind of amazing after
two big L's. I mean, we talked all season long about how deep the Big Ten was, and I feel like it came back to bite them a little bit this past week. Penn State lost. Ohio State lost. Their playoff hopes now hang in the balance. They're hanging on Wisconsin.
Don't want to toot my own horn, but I did predict that preseason. But we'll get into some of that a little later. We'll start off week in review. It was a great week in college football, and it's going to be an even greater week next week. We'll start off with Alabama LSU. Kind of an under the radar game. You know, LSU stuck around for a little while. What were your thoughts on this game?
I don't know if it was an under-the-radar game. It's just there were so many other good games going on.
Well, for an Alabama-LSU game.
Right. Yeah. I mean, LSU, I think at the time, was ranked – were they ranked outside the top – they were ranked inside the top 20 at 19th.
19.
But this game was really never very competitive. LSU was able to get a field goal right before half. But this was – I mean, with all the other games on, I never really felt like there was a need to turn this one on the TV because, again, when you look at the statistics, Alabama pretty much dominated in most statistical categories. I mean, they had actually what's interesting here.
LSU was able to stick around. I mean, yard-wise, it was pretty
yardage-wise, you're right because LSU had more total yards than Alabama, but for whatever reason, they just weren't able to put it in the end zone, weren't able to get a lot of points, and the Tide rolled over the Tigers.
Yeah, and they really struggled. I mean, that was kind of the main point. We talked about with Oklahoma State how a couple weeks ago they played Texas. Just was able to. I mean, it was kind of like TCU. They were able to get the ball down the field, just weren't able to punch into the score. I think if LSU had a little bit more experience, maybe the quarterback position, to be able to do better in the red zone, they'd be a little more in shape. They were 9 for 19 on third down, so they were able to stay in the game relatively easily. I'm still I'm looking at Jalen Hurts, the way he played, 11 for 24, still a little bit shaky. I know he's still developing. He's still young. It's hard to believe he's only a sophomore. But I think going forward, if Alabama's going to face a big test like Mississippi State and Auburn, they're really going to have to step it up a little bit. Jalen Hurts is going to have to be more consistent.
Yeah, again, though, I mean, I don't feel like they underperformed in this game. It was at Bryant Denny Stadium for them, so it was a home game for them. I mean, LSU's played them tough as long as I can remember. I mean, it's always been a really good rivalry game to watch. So, you could argue that some of their players weren't able to perform as well as they should have in this big of a game. But I think at the end of the day, Alabama's 9-0. It was an impressive win to kind of boost their resume. Obviously, we saw it wasn't enough for them to jump over Georgia.
It was their first ranked win.
Yeah, but I mean, I really don't think there's anything that they could take away and feel like, oh, we should have done this better, we should have done that better.
Now, we'll be interested to see next week when they play Mississippi State. They've usually struggled against dual threat quarterbacks. You got Nick Fitzgerald coming in for the Bulldogs. Could be that guy to try and break through, but we'll see.
Next game that we're going to touch on, this one, Bedlam lived up to the hype.
This was a basketball score.
Yes, it was. Oklahoma finally came out on top, 62-52 over Oklahoma State. Baker Mayfield accounted for 598 total yards.
Heisman Trophy favorite.
Yeah, I think at this point it's
pretty obvious.
It's pretty obvious. I mean, he had 5 touchdowns. He was 24 for 36. He did throw 2 interceptions, but Mason Rudolph on the flip side, and this honestly was a Heisman Trophy. I mean, this was similar, not the same as Lamar and Deshaun last year, but in terms of
2 of the best quarterbacks, arguably top 5 in the country.
Easily. And Mason Rudolph, I mean, he had 448 total yards, so he performed very well.
He did his job.
Also had 5 touchdowns, but did throw 2 interceptions. But, I mean, at the end of the day, Oklahoma was able to come out of there with a win and just an amazing game.
I think the defense has to take Mason Rudolph out to dinner because he did his job. 5 touchdowns, 448 yards. There was absolutely 0 defense. Each team had over 650 yards of offense. That's kind of alarming when you look at who ended up coming on top. Oklahoma. In years past, we said, oh, they got no defense. Earlier this year, okay, they might have a defense. They don't have a defense.
There was no defense in the second quarter. Looking here in the box score, you had a touchdown 7 seconds in by Oklahoma. Then less than a minute later, with 14:07 on the clock, Oklahoma State punches in a touchdown. You have another touchdown on an 84-yard pass, which results in an Oklahoma touchdown. You have another touchdown. So 4 touchdowns within the first 4 minutes of the second quarter, and then you had another touchdown by Oklahoma, 2 more touchdowns by Oklahoma State just in the second quarter. It was 14-10 at the end of the first. It was 38 all going into half.
What was incredible, each team, they combined for 5 turnovers. So if you take away those turnovers, they could have been in the 70s.
Easily.
It's really hard to believe. Now, going forward, I think Oklahoma's obviously, the obvious point is they're going to have to start playing defense. TCU's ranked 6th in total defense. So if they're able to slow Baker Mayfield down and force them to make some errors, Oklahoma's really going to have to rely on that defense. That's probably not something they want to do.
But in the 112th meeting of Oklahoma State, I believe, they're scoring 114 points. Made for a very interesting
in honor of
ball
112
game.
score 114, not bad.
Very interesting ball game. Next game that we're going to touch on from this past week, Ohio State. A game that a lot of people really did not expect, especially with the blowout score. I mean, I know that you have been a little bit higher on Ohio State all season than I have, but even I didn't see this result.
Well, I wanted to see J.T. Barrett be the quarterback that we all expected him to be when we came into the preseason. I mean, we expected by his senior year he'd be able to finally turn things around. He kind of went back to the J.T. Barrett we saw back in the playoff game last year. Wasn't able to do anything right, 4 interceptions.
4 turnovers.
And he was their leading rusher, so they literally relied on him completely. And they're just do or die with him. And at this point, they just died with him. Nathan Stanley, on the other hand, 5 touchdowns, no picks for Iowa. Really a coming out party for him. And it was one of the greatest scenes I've ever seen. I know we've seen Iowa on the big stage before, but they really showed up. It's kind of impressive what they're doing down in Iowa.
I think the big difference between Iowa and Ohio State in this game was the turnovers on Ohio State's side versus the lack of mistakes on Iowa's side.
Yeah.
Iowa played a clean game. Quarterback 5 touchdowns, only 226 yards passing, and then rushing. Their running back Bradley, I think is how you say his name, had 118 yards on the ground, 20 carries. So not too impressive, but still they were able to limit the mistakes. Played well in the trenches, and really just dominated Ohio State.
Iowa just had a great game plan. They really exposed Ohio State's secondary, which is kind of what Trace McSorley did a little bit in the Penn State game. And I'm still trying to figure out Ohio State's defensive line coming into this year. They're saying, hey, they're better than Clemson. They're probably got 3 first-round draft picks on there. Where is that defensive line that was supposed to be there? Because they got killed on the ground.
They did.
Killed. So we'll have to see. I mean, Iowa's got Wisconsin coming up next. Wisconsin ranks a little bit better on defense. They're top 5 in total defense. So Iowa's going to need just as good of a performance, if not better.
I think it's safe to say, though, now that we're so late in the season, I think we're going into week 11. Ohio State, with 2 losses, is out of the playoff.
With a blowout loss, there's no chance for them.
Nope. Yeah, even though it was on the road for them. They're out. Next game, we're staying in the Big Ten. We've got Penn State, Michigan State. This one was a 3.5-hour rain delay in the middle of it. Stands were essentially empty. I think they even had some hail. Michigan State gets it done on a last-second field goal to topple the Nittany Lions 27-24. This is Penn State's 2nd straight loss. Do you think is this an imminent slide for Penn State?
A little bit. James Franklin said this week that his team seems to not be able to handle the spotlight, and maybe it's because they've gone a couple years without having to deal with this sort of spotlight. Caught a little bit of it last year, but they've really kind of buckled when they've risen to the occasion and gotten up to the top 10 like this. They just haven't been able to put it together. I mean, they've been close. Let's not forget, they've been close. They have nearly beat Ohio State, nearly beat Michigan State. But in the end, this is just kind of the games that Michigan State's win. They win in the 20s.
They didn't
game-winning field goal.
Yeah, no, it was an impressive win for Michigan State, especially with the conditions. You think about the conditions and the delay. I mean, that's essentially their layoff between, I think, the first half and the second half was almost the length of a regular game.
You saw them in the locker room. They were throwing food at each other just to
they
pass
were passing time.
Yeah.
But Penn State just didn't finish. I mean, they had nothing going on in the 4th quarter. Michigan State was able to put together 10 points, obviously with that last-second field goal, which gave them the win. Penn State also had 3 turnovers. And you turn the ball over in a game like that where field position is huge and critical and field goals are critical, it may come back to bite you. And I think at the end of the day, I don't want to say it was a hangover from their loss on the road at Ohio State, but it kind of looks like it was.
A little bit like carrying over from that 4th quarter. For some reason, they didn't use Barkley as much as they thought they would. Saquon Barkley, you got a Heisman Trophy contender, and you rush him, 9 times for 60 yards? Didn't even use him that much. Now, maybe that layoff just really impacted him, or maybe they just thought that Michigan State's run defense would stop him anyway, so they just decided to throw it. But, yeah, really a head-scratcher for me. I thought Penn State would rebound pretty well, but wasn't meant to be.
Now we're going to jump over into the ACC. This game, we had Virginia Tech and Miami. The Canes came out on top in fairly dominant fashion, winning 28-10 over the Hokies. You know I've been high on the Hurricanes.
You have.
So I want to hear what are your thoughts after seeing that performance?
I was impressed. I really was, despite the fact that Rozier for Miami threw 3 picks in the first half. Now, at that point, you look at that and you go, oh, God, he might not be able to handle the spotlight like this.
Yeah.
He was able to bounce back. That turnover chain was out in full force, shining on the sidelines. I think the amazing part for me was that Braxton Berrios, their leading target, he's kind of like their Hunter Renfrow, only 1 catch for Miami. So they were able to spread the ball around, do what they needed to do. And, they really made Josh Jackson look like a freshman on Virginia Tech's side. They did what Clemson did to him.
Yeah, no, I think with Virginia Tech, I mean, they're 7-2, 3-2 now in conference play, and they've had 2 big games all year. I mean, yes, West Virginia, the season opener, was an important game for them, but they've had 2 big conference games all year. And in both of those games, they've fallen flat.
Yeah.
So it's great when you're beating teams like Delaware and Old Dominion and UNC and Duke, but when you look at the meat of their schedule, besides that touchdown win against West Virginia at the season opener, it's not that impressive.
They're a young team, and they looked like a young team when they got to those big games. And it's understandable, but at times you think, okay, they need to be able to step up, and you think Justin Fuente will be able to get him going.
Yeah.
Sometimes they just resorted back to their old ways.
I don't feel like the season's been derailed for them. I mean, they have Georgia Tech on the road, Pitt at home, then UVA on the road.
10-2 would be a spectacular season.
I think 10-2 is feasible for them. I think 10-2 is a great building year for them. If they're getting to a bowl game, a good bowl game, they go 11-2. That's a great year. But I do think that it's important to take note of the fact that in both of those games, Clemson and Miami, it just didn't look very good.
They're a flawed team, and credit to Miami for being able to exploit those flaws. They did what they had to do, and talk about a confidence builder going into the Notre Dame week. It's huge. The fact that both these teams are at home too, I think, are fantastic for Miami. That's what they need.
Last game that we're going to touch on, this one was a nail-biter for a good while. Clemson on the road at NC State. Tigers pull it out 38-31. This one came down to
a last-second throw. Honestly, kind of like last year, and where Clemson was able to intercept the ball to end up winning the game against NC State. This reminded me a lot of the Florida State game last year. Towards the end of the season, big game in conference, on the road, national spotlight ranked game. Yeah. Clemson able to pull out with zero defense, honestly.
Oh, no, the defense did not show up.
Finley tore him up in the
first half. I mean, the second half they came out and held NC State to only 10 points. 10 and all 10 of those were in the fourth quarter. Third quarter, they really shut them down. But this was NC State's moment. Ranked team. Finally, this was, I think it's the first time that it was a ranked versus ranked matchup in
a solid amount of time.
Yeah, it's been a while. So this was it was a home game for them. They had Clemson, who they should have beaten last year. It would have given them basically a
lock to the ACC championship
a lock to the ACC championship game, and it would have been a huge win for Dave Doeren, I think. Dave Doeren and the program. And they had Clemson on the ropes for a while, but just couldn't get it done. And I think that frustration was apparent in the post-game press conference, where Doeren was kind of going after, I don't want to say petty things, but you could tell that, and I mean I would be too. He was extremely frustrated with not being able to close the deal 2 years now in a row.
It's really going to hang over him. Yeah, I mean, NC State, they're a developing program. Dave Doeren's done a great job, kind of risen them out from what they really were a few years ago was absolutely nothing. So credit to them for actually being able to compete in these kind of games. But yeah, they just, I think overall the talent that Clemson had on their sidelines just shined in the very end. It was kind of the X factor of the game. Deion Kane, he's honestly becoming more of the Mike Williams that we expected him to be coming in this year. It's been really impressive to see, and Hunter Renfrow was obviously big, like we've seen in the past. But, going forward, big game coming up for Clemson against Florida State, not to be taken lightly. Florida State, not as good this year compared to NC State, but, still a team they're going to be out for blood going forward. So it's a big confidence builder going forward.
Huge road win for Clemson. I mean, I feel like this was going to be our toughest game to win all year after we saw how Florida State's season began to develop. Especially with it being on the road and how it ended last year. I think this was a huge hurdle. I mean, you heard all the players talk about in their Monday and Tuesday press conferences about the championship phase and that being November. And like Dabo said in his press conference today, which actually was a really good point, the Clemson-Florida State game, the magnitude of the game has not changed for Clemson because the winner of this game for Clemson determines who's going to go to the ACC championship.
You got the orange britches out. They're wearing them for a reason.
Orange britches. And, I mean, you can look at what Florida State is dealing with. They're playing for bowl eligibility. And I even heard that they're trying to reschedule their game against Bethune-Cookman.
Yeah, Bethune-Cookman, just even get that
to try and
sixth win,
to bowl eligibility if they lose this game. But, again, when you look at Clemson and you're focusing on Clemson, if Clemson loses this game, they're out of the ACC championship.
Now, they shouldn't lose this game.
No, they should not lose this game.
Absolutely not, by any means. It's at home.
But it's Florida State.
But it is
and it's a rivalry game. Florida State's going to be playing, more than likely, for bowl eligibility. And those guys are going to be out there for pride. They're going to be out there for pride.
What are they, 3-5? Probably the scariest 3-5 team you could look at just because of the name that comes with them and the talent across the board.
If there's a 3-5 team out there that could beat Clemson, this is Florida State.
Absolutely, it's going to be Florida State. So it's going to be important. Clemson's really rebounded well after the Syracuse loss. They've really been balanced, passing and rushing attack. Kelly Bryant looks healthy after 20 rushing attempts. Mm-hmm. That should give you confidence going forward. So I think Clemson's in good shape right now to take down Florida State, but we'll see.
We'll make those game picks a little bit later in the show, but now we're going to transition over to some college football playoff talk. The rankings came out about an hour and a half ago. Some of your reactions. I mean, nothing really changed too high up. I mean, you saw Penn State, Ohio State drop significantly. USC, I was kind of surprised that they're so high up at 11.
Up to 11, yeah. But I think they benefited a lot from the losses. That kind of helped a little bit. And they took down Arizona, so that was a ranked win under their belt they were able to get. Now, they're 8-2, a quiet 8-2 team that's really kind of creeping up the rankings going forward to the Pac-12
Do you feel like a two-loss USC?
No.
I don't.
Pac-12 in general right now doesn't look good.
It's Washington.
Washington right now, they do have Stanford. They got a lot ahead of them. They got Stanford, Washington State, potentially USC. So they've got the chances, unlike Wisconsin, maybe to creep up those rankings. But right now it's looking tough for them with all the one-loss teams that are ahead of them and the different conferences that are represented. I wasn't too surprised with the top 10 as a whole. The TCU-Miami thing's going to come into play again. I know we're going to keep talking about that.
Oh, yeah.
But it'll be an elimination game coming up with Oklahoma and TCU, so it doesn't really matter too much. Yeah. And then you got Miami and Notre Dame too. So great top 10 matchups coming in this week. The one surprising for me, how in the world is LSU still ranked? At this point, the only reason LSU needs to be
because they played Alabama
is so that Alabama can at least have one top 25 win.
I think they're ranking some schools up in the top 25, so it boosts Alabama's strength of record.
The one below them, Northwestern, that helps Wisconsin. They have a top 25 win now.
Well, yeah, and speaking of SEC, do you feel like Auburn has the chance, I think they do, to ruin a two-team SEC college football playoff?
They are the only two-loss team, I think, that has a chance to even make the playoff at this point, just what they have ahead of them. They have 3 monumental games right ahead of them in their schedule right now.
Do you think if they clear all 3 of those, they're a lock just based off of that?
I got to say, with the losses that they've lost, all right, if you're going to say LSU is a top 25 team right now, and Auburn lost by a touchdown to LSU on the road, not a terrible loss, and a loss to Clemson, not a terrible loss.
14-6 in a weird game. Yeah.
In a weird game, but they were able to manage that game kind of well.
Yeah.
If they're able to beat Georgia, Alabama, and then one of those teams again, it's going to be tough to keep them out. It really is.
If you close the season, if you close the last 3 weeks of the season and you beat the number 1 and number 2 teams respectively,
and then beat one of them again,
and then probably beat one of them again.
Oh, wait, they would face Georgia, I guess technically. Yeah.
I think so. I feel like they're probably gonna put them at 4, but yeah, because you would have had a loss to, this is all theoretical, a Clemson team that's also in the playoff. Yeah. Now the LSU team would not. They're not going to make playoffs.
Not an awful loss. Not like a 55-24 loss to Iowa.
4-point loss on the road. So maybe, but I still think that there's no way Auburn gets through Georgia and Alabama. Even though both of those games are at home, there's no way they win.
The odds are really against them. And Auburn's been a good team all year. They've been a pretty valuable team for the SEC. Jarrett Stidham's finally figuring things out, but that's just such a daunting task.
Ooh. They're going to be great games, though.
Hey, if Malzahn's up to the challenge and they can get it done, all the credit to them. Yeah. But I think the odds are definitely against them right now. So
consensus with the rankings this week is that, nothing really too surprising, except for USC. I feel like being up so far.
Yeah,
because the top 4 are top 4 or top 6 are unchanged. Top 5
are still unchanged. TCU, yeah, and it'll be interesting to see. I'm really interested to see going forward what the committee does. If Oklahoma, depending on who wins the Oklahoma TCU game, if that vaults them then ahead of Clemson. Because I think right now in their eyes, they're pretty close, 4 and 5. Clemson just gets that one ranked extra game ahead of them. But if Oklahoma destroys TCU, we could be looking at a battle for 4th right there. So,
what's interesting is when you look at the top 10, 8 of the top 10 teams are playing a ranked opponent this week. And the teams that are not are Clemson and Washington. Clemson's playing Florida State, who could easily beat them. Washington is playing on the road at Stanford.
That's a tough game.
Huge hurdle.
A huge
now,
game.
I know that you've got Oklahoma playing TCU. You've got Miami playing Notre Dame. So you've got Georgia playing Auburn. So you have a little bit of top 10 going after top 10. But I think you're going to see at least 4 top 10 teams lose. You have to count the 2 because there's 2 matchups where there's top 10 opponents going like it's a top 10 matchup, but I feel like there's 2 other teams right now in the top 10 that are going to fall this weekend.
Listen, if you're Washington and you're USC and you're Michigan State, keep winning because these teams ahead of you are going to fall. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. It's college football. Keep winning. I think the best part about this is you see all these ranked games where people keep complaining, it's 14 playoff, we need 8. you got elimination games right here, basically. I mean, these are basically playoff games.
These are quarterfinal
coming
games.
up. So
Miami and Notre Dame, then you've got Oklahoma, TCU. Those are quarterfinal games.
Exactly. So it'll all even itself out. It's gonna be tough to even predict these games alone, get them right.
I think the top 10 is gonna look drastically different.
It's gonna look
next Tuesday than what it looks right now, because you're going to have, you're gonna have at least 2 teams that are gonna lose, and what's really gonna be interesting is if Georgia loses on the road at Auburn, Miami loses at home to Notre Dame, you're going to have an Alabama at 10-0, and then you're going to have a Wisconsin at 10-0, and those are going to be your 2 undefeated teams. We know where Alabama would be; they'd be a 1. But where would you put that Wisconsin amongst?
Especially after winning against Iowa, who just took down Ohio State and is now ranked. So now Wisconsin could have a second-ranked game under their belt, which is kind of something that the committee is slacking on Wisconsin for. Is hey, they're not
playing
these ranked
teams.
Michigan will probably creep their way in if they keep winning. If they're 9-2, committee's probably going to put them in the top 25. So, I mean, for a team that's had a pretty weak schedule so far, I think Wisconsin's got a lot ahead of them they can do. Especially if Ohio State and Penn State stay up there and play them eventually in the Big 10 championship. So it'll be interesting. I think this is probably going to be the last really big week up until conference championships, because rivalry can be interesting and all, but you don't have some of these top ranked games like you do this week. So I think it's going to be really good.
Yeah, I mean it's we're not talking about UCF down there at 8-0. They're still undefeated, but I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the top 25 shapes up next week. We have a friend who is calling in, and we've got Landon on speaker. He's going to talk to us about Wisconsin. Landon, can you hear us?
Yes, sir, I can.
All right, what you got, buddy?
Well, first of all, in my opinion, I believe that Miami and Wisconsin both should be ahead of TCU. TCU and Oklahoma right now, just based on the fact that they're undefeated. Also the fact that although Wisconsin hasn't played many teams, I know I'm biased, but I mean our defense is giving up 13 points a game. Mm-hmm. There's not very many defenses who are giving that. Oklahoma's giving up 28 points a game right now. So I kind of just want to see what you guys think about that, because I know Jay has been talking me out. He's not really on the Wisconsin train.
I can't shut Jay up about Wisconsin and Miami. It's been tough every week. I think really what's keeping them back right now, despite I credit the committee for putting them top 10. They are undefeated. I think going forward, like I said before, you're going to see one of these teams fall out, so it's probably not going to matter anyway if Wisconsin and Miami keep winning. I think right now just the big wins that are kind of trumping a TCU and an Oklahoma in the Big 12 ahead of those teams. Now, I do like Wisconsin. They got the Northwestern win. They got the Iowa win potentially coming up. They got a lot ahead of them. Miami obviously beat Virginia Tech. But I think that the win for TCU against Oklahoma State, you got West Virginia, and we suffered one loss to Iowa State by 7 points. Iowa State's still ranked, obviously. So I think that's kind of what's keeping them ahead. I think the one thing you could argue, though, is the fact that Oklahoma has 0 defense. TCU at least has a reasonable defense that can compete with teams and keep games manageable. Oklahoma doesn't have a lick of defense at all. So I think if you actually watch the game, the eye test you could use against Oklahoma. But I think the fact that they not only beat Ohio State and they have other wins that they've won so far, I think that's what's kind of keeping them ahead. But I think it's all going to even out eventually.
Well, I think go ahead, Landon.
Okay, one thing I would say is that Wisconsin has struggled very much on offense, and I mean our running game is just incredible compared to most other teams. Well, Hornibrook has really struggled in the past couple games with his throwing, and although he struggled, I truly do think that our defense and our running game can take on any other defense that there is, just because of the fact that Big Ten football is so different than your SEC and your ACC offenses and defenses. Wisconsin runs the classic fullback power formation when you got these guys in the SEC and ACC running the spread. Mm-hmm. So it's a tale of 2 different offenses and 2 different defenses, and I'd really like to see a Wisconsin versus a Georgia versus an Alabama, kind of see those 2 types of football kind of butt heads and see which one comes out on top.
Yeah, I mean, they remind me a lot of Michigan State. I think if you want to compare the 2 teams together, hopefully if they do end up playing a team like Alabama, you won't see them get shut out in the college football playoff like you did Michigan State a couple years ago. Yeah. I think, like I said, I love Jonathan Taylor. I think he's a fantastic running back. He's really what kind of makes up for some of the mistakes that Hornibrook has made the entire year. Now, he's a developing quarterback. He's pretty efficient, but I do love what he's doing. And, like I said, I think going forward 2 weeks from now, if we're still having this debate, I think you're going to have a lot more behind Wisconsin to use against these teams.
I feel like Wisconsin's biggest games are left to be played. I feel like when you've got an Iowa game this weekend at home, they're able to get that done. That's a top 20 win right there. You've got Northwestern now in the college football playoff rankings. I think they're clocking in at 25. Michigan is still a big game for them. I know the Wolverines aren't ranked anymore, but I feel like that if they can win convincingly with Iowa this weekend, and then they get past Michigan, and then they close the season out at Minnesota, if they can win those 3 games in pretty convincing fashion, I feel like that they have a good case for making the playoff. My biggest issue personally with Wisconsin so far this season is the fact that they're as one-dimensional with just being able to run the ball. I mean, it's great. And, I mean, Wisconsin has churned out some amazing backs for the last 5-6 years. It's truly been extremely impressive. But I'm just not sure if they're going to be able to sustain that in the trenches with a team like Alabama or a team like Georgia. Now, Clemson's looked a little bit soft on defense at times in the last few games, so they may fare better against them. But I do feel like Clemson's front four, when they're on, they're pretty stout. And so if Wisconsin's running game all of a sudden just vaporizes in a college football playoff semifinal, I'm just not sure I can rely on y'all's quarterback to put up, you know what I mean? Because if it's a lower scoring game, yes, that favors Wisconsin. But if like you said, with the ACC and the SEC and these spread offenses, and you're scoring points, unless Wisconsin's able to manage the clock really well, I just don't see them being favored in those kinds of games.
Right. And one thing that I think Wisconsin is, if they do make this playoff, I've said since about week 5 that really the only game that matters for Wisconsin is the Big Ten championship, especially with Penn State and Ohio State losing. Because if we lose one game before the Big Ten championship, even if we do win the Big Ten, I think that our chances are done just because of our schedule. But one thing I will say that if we do make the college playoff is that our defense is going to be able to hang in. I mean, we've given up 120 points all year, but coming down the stretch, we've only given up 48 points in the second half. We went the first 3 weeks without giving up a single point in the second half. So I think that our coaches are trying to prepare the team for the opportunity to make the playoff. I think this week is going to be our biggest test for the rest of the season. Iowa, coming off a huge win. It is at Camp Randall, but I think you're going to see the true Wisconsin team come out. You're not going to see the cookie cutter, the Purdue team. You're not going to see how we play against Northwestern. I think you're going to see the true Wisconsin team.
Well, I think.
Go ahead.
I think if they're able to take advantage of that moment, I mean, you mentioned the statistic about not letting up a touchdown in the second half of the first 3 games. I mean, those games were against Utah State, FAU.
Not even a single point, though.
Again, their defenses look great, and their running game has been nothing but impressive.
What Wisconsin does, they do very well.
Yes, absolutely. So if they're able to take advantage of the moment and not let it become too big for them, or we've talked about earlier on the show, Virginia Tech. They've had 2 big games all year with Clemson and Miami, and in both of those games they fell rather flat. So if they're able to show up for the Iowa game, if they're able to beat Michigan at home, I mean, those are 2 big games for them. They're both at home. I feel like in those games, Wisconsin should, if they stick to their game plan, they should be able to get it done.
In the short term, this is huge for Wisconsin because Iowa just came off, like I said, against that win against Ohio State. So if you can compare them week in to week out, if you see a Wisconsin team just absolutely destroy Iowa this week, in the short term, that Ohio State game for Iowa is still fresh in people's minds. So you can use that to compare and look, hey, Wisconsin, was able to get the job done, and we should reward them for it.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where even if we do win, with the way the committee's been the past couple weeks, I just don't know how they're going to jump Oklahoma and TCU. And what surprised me most is that Miami didn't even jump Oklahoma or TCU. I didn't understand that at all.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's been a Miami supporter for the last few weeks, that did sort of surprise me. Although with Oklahoma and the way that they played in the Bedlam game with Oklahoma State, I mean, that was a tough game for them. TCU this past week.
They played Texas. They played pretty bad.
Texas. Yeah. But that did surprise me that they didn't give Miami the nod over at least TCU. But I still feel like at the end of the day, if Wisconsin, and there's looking at their schedule, besides the Iowa game, Michigan game, they should be able to get through it undefeated. If they're able to win the Big Ten championship and they're undefeated through that point, they're going to get into the playoff. Now, they may not be 1, they may not be 2, they may be 3 or 4, But I think at the end of the day, if you're a Power 5 team and you go undefeated regular season, you win your conference championship.
Yeah.
I think you'd even give them the nod over a team like Georgia or Alabama that loses one game in that SEC championship game. I think you have to put Wisconsin in.
Possibly.
Going forward, I mean, yes, they tried to schedule. What did they schedule? BYU. Mm-hmm. It's not their fault that a couple years ago they scheduled BYU. It's not their fault that BYU was terrible this year. They at least tried. They've played LSU and Bama in the past, so at least they're trying. I don't see how you can keep them out if they go undefeated. I don't think there's any way you can really argue it. You just kind of have to give them the nod just because they're undefeated.
But it was one of the and I'm just looking forward to if that situation happens, what the committee will do, because no matter what their decision, you're gonna have a bunch of ticked off fans of whatever team gets left out. Kind of like Penn State.
That's what we love about it.
Yeah. College football playoff never fails to disappoint. Well, we appreciate you calling in, Landon. Good talking to you.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, have a good one, man. Thanks.
Yep, you too.
All right, I think we may have one more person who wants to call in. We'll keep the phone on standby.
He's calling right now.
There he is.
Right on schedule.
The man, the myth, the legend, Evan McDowell. Can you hear us, sir?
I can. Hope y'all can hear me. How's it going?
Loud and clear, man. We're doing good.
Going pretty well. What kind of questions you got for us?
Well, real quickly, I just Googled the Mount Union Purple Raiders. They are undefeated in D3 play right now, 8-0 in conference, 9-0 overall. Why aren't they in the college football playoff rankings, man? There's like some 2-loss, 3-loss teams in there. I should be the Purple Raiders in at 24 next week. What the heck's going on, boys?
Can you tell me who they've played so far that you feel like would be a big win for them?
Well, I most certainly can. Matter of fact, they got some good wins here. Let's pull their schedule up real quick.
Yeah.
So they have scored no less than 43 points in every game so far this year. So still an offense right there.
Speak into the phone, or we're not going to be able to hear you. Speaking.
That was their lowest scoring game of the year. Also, their worst defensive game of the year was 43-14 shellac in Ohio. But other than that, no close games. Still not going to be football, and I am sure.
Well, Evan, we couldn't hear you then, but we don't really need to hear you because there's teams on that schedule that, quite frankly, would be games that other teams pay for them to come play them.
Although we've seen upsets before.
I will say, though, right now, if you matched up Mountain Union against LSU, you could argue that Mountain Union could potentially play with Troy, a team that did beat LSU.
So maybe a Mountain Union versus a UCF?
Potentially. Hey, you know what?
That's a Big Six bowl game right there.
We should throw in that Middle Tennessee State team in there to be in that like the NCAA tournament. Throw them in there and see if they can challenge the top dogs one week. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah.
Interesting. I just didn't see enough Purple Raider love on ESPN this evening. But for real, let's say Georgia loses this weekend at Auburn. Let's say Alabama loses in the Iron Bowl. Does the winner of the SEC championship game still get in a one-loss SEC champion? Let's say Notre Dame wins out, maybe Miami wins out and wins the ACC. What are we looking at there with a one, maybe even a two-loss SEC champion?
Well, I think the committee's already shown enough in the last couple weeks that if Notre Dame continues their trajectory, even with their one loss, they're getting in. They've got them at 3. There's no reason for them to drop Notre Dame. I think that there's a very real possibility that Georgia and or Alabama will lose before the end of the season, going into the SEC championship game. Now, they do have Clemson at 4, so obviously the committee feels like Clemson has a better shot at making it than Miami. But for the sake of your example, if Miami is able to win the ACC and get in, assuming they go undefeated regular season, I think Miami's a lock. I think Notre Dame's a lock. I think it would come down to, do you put a second SEC team in, or do you put a potentially undefeated Wisconsin or a Big 12 champion? In that scenario, I would probably default to Wisconsin based solely on the fact that they're undefeated. Their strength of schedule compared to the other two schools is probably not as high, but I think at the end of the day, since they're undefeated, they'll get that nod. I don't know. What do you think, Bradley?
It'd be interesting because, all right, so you're saying your theoretical example was that Auburn takes down both Alabama and Georgia, and then Georgia would beat Auburn in that SEC championship game? Is that what I hear you saying?
Yeah, basically. Just like if Alabama and Georgia both lose before the SEC championship game, whichever one of them, obviously Georgia, ends up in the SEC championship, like a one-loss Georgia as an SEC champion. Mm-hmm. Let's say Wisconsin wins the table, wins the Big Ten. Let's say Miami loses this weekend to Notre Dame and wins the ACC. So
I don't think you can put them in that.
No, I think you would. I think because Notre Dame is also another playoff team. I think you would put because if even if Miami loses to Notre Dame, who would be a potential playoff team, and they beat Clemson, who right now is in the top 4, I feel like that win against Clemson in the ACC championship.
I don't know. I feel like with the lack of Miami's schedule this year, I think you'd have to give the nod to Oklahoma.
Well,
if they're able to
Virginia Tech.
If Oklahoma's able to win out, though, with the number of wins they would have had by the end of the year, I think you got to give them the nod over Miami.
Since they've beaten Ohio State?
Beaten Ohio State, they would have beaten Oklahoma State, TCU, and then maybe TCU again. That's going to be tough to keep them out. Especially if you're coming down between that and Wisconsin now. If Wisconsin runs the table, they're in.
But if Oklahoma loses to TCU this weekend,
well, maybe what if TCU wins the Big 12 then with one loss? I think either way, if one of those teams wins and goes in with one loss and wins the Big 12 championship game, you're gonna have to give them the nod over Miami. I think you have to. It's the nightmare scenario for the ACC. That's what they.
I don't feel like they would get in over Miami though. If Miami's only loss is to Notre Dame, who is also another playoff team. Because you've got an Oklahoma team whose loss was to Iowa State, who's not a playoff
Miami,
team.
all they would have with the one Clemson win and then a Virginia Tech win, which might not be that impressive.
It is important to note that right now they have Oklahoma at 5, they have Miami at 7. So they feel like that Oklahoma, even with the loss to Iowa State, is still more impressive than Miami's 8-0.
So Auburn is the wild card. It's kind of the team that the SEC doesn't want to even have in there right now.
Yes,
they want to see Georgia and Alabama keep winning out and try to get 2 teams in. So. That'd be an interesting scenario, though. I'd love to see what the committee would do with that.
The committee would be sweating bullets.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you boys real quick before I take it off the air. Do you see any scenario in which at least one 2-loss team makes the playoff?
I mean, like I said before, I think it's only Auburn. Auburn is probably the only team right now. USC, just the lack of quality wins that the Pac-12 really has right now.
They got destroyed by Notre Dame.
They got killed.
Destroyed by Notre Dame and beaten by Washington State. So even with the win against Arizona and Stanford,
I mean, as we saw like last year, Penn State got blown out by Michigan. Committee took that into account and didn't put them in. So I think Auburn right now is the only team they're gonna have to win out completely to even have a chance.
Yeah, no, they have to beat Georgia and Alabama in the regular season,
and
then in the SEC championship to make it. I think that is the only scenario where you could have a 2-loss team in the college football playoff.
Well, sounds good to me. I appreciate you letting me call in. It's been a lot of fun, and I'll see y'all soon.
All right, well, we will see you Saturday for Tiger Town Countdown. Don't miss.
Bear down, baby. Let's go.
Evan is the bear. Appreciate you calling in, Evan. Thanks.
Thank y'all.
All right, well.
That was fun.
Yeah, had a couple callers for this week's show. I think, again, the plan is to do one on Friday. We'll do a pick'em show like we did last week. It's been a lot of fun, though. Week 10 is in the books. Moving on to Week 11.
Week 11, things start really getting serious now.
Yeah,
as if they
November
haven't already.
Championship phase. As I say, we got orange britches this weekend for the Clemson game, so it's gonna be big.
So catch us on Tiger Town Countdown Saturday morning at 10 a.m. outside of Stadium Suites. We will be there talking a lot of college football. We got a lot to talk about.
Be a lot of fun. For Bradley Kendall, I'm Jay Smith. This has been After Further Review.
Thanks for watching.